I was invited to speak on the topic of the global governance of international migration. This is a topic, as you know, that I think is increasingly attracting attention both amongst academics and amongst policymakers too. But it does seem to me that it's a topic where there's still rather more heat than light. It's not quite clear to me what exactly is wrong with the current system. It's often not quite clear to me what is being proposed to replace the current system. I'm not sure that we really know whether the new proposals would work in practice. And I think there are a lot of questions still to be asked about proposals for the global governance of international migration. So what I thought I would do, if we could move to the next slide, please. I'm hoping it's up. What I thought I would do is simply to try to clarify what I see as the key arguments around the global governance of international migration today. I'll say a few words firstly about current arrangements, how we currently try to manage or control international migration. I'll then lay out what I see as the 5 key arguments that are put forward for greater global governance of international migration. I'll then say a few words about what I think are some of the obstacles to global governance of international migration, and I think those obstacles actually are often underestimated. And finally, a personal forecast or prognosis for where I think we might be going in terms of the global governance of international migration. Next slide, please. Is it up? Shall I continue? Great. Okay, I'm hoping the next slide is up, showing current arrangements. Very much. This slide is simply to summarize the current arrangements that we have for managing or governing international migration. Clearly, the focus still is on national policies and national programs, the first bullet point there. At the same time, plainly, we have a proliferation of bilateral agreements between various states, numbering at least 200 and probably more by now since the OECD brought out their very influential report. A series of regional consultative processes that try to bring together states within a single region with shared interests to come around the table and discuss those interests, and 1 or 2 global dialogues too. We also need to count supranational structures, and here, of course, the classic model is the European Union, free movement of people across borders, and similar models trying to be set up, for example, in places like West Africa today. Plainly, we have multilateral agencies that are involved in the governance of migration too. UNHCR, mainly, of course, focusing on refugees, also stateless persons and increasingly IDPs. ILO, Manolo, of course, will know about the ILO. It's concerned about migrant workers. We have the IOM working outside the UN system with, I think, rather a broad operational range in migration, and so on and so forth. And I think the final element of this institutional arrangement at the moment that we have on the global governance of international migration relates to a series of international legal frameworks. Clearly, we have a very strong international legal framework for trafficking and smuggling. Clearly, we have a very strong legal framework for refugees, but I would argue that for the rest of migration, both legal and irregular or illegal, our current legal frameworks are not quite as robust or well implemented as those are for refugees and for trafficking. The highlight of this slide, I think, is as follows. Clearly, we do have multilateral arrangements for international migration. We're not talking about a total absence of global governance. At the same time, I think it's clear that the focus is still on nation states and how they respond on a unilateral basis to international migration. It's clear there is no single UN agency dealing with international migration in its entirety, and it's clear that the legal framework is not consolidated and is still rather scattered. Next slide, please. Against that backdrop, it seems to me that if you look at the literature and the increasing number of policy documents that are coming out on this topic, there are 5 main arguments that are being mobilized for greater global governance of international migration. The first simply relates to the character of contemporary international migration. According to the IOM's latest statistics, there are 214 million international migrants in the world. That's around 1 in 35 people on Earth today is an international migrant. Clearly, international migration is a more global phenomenon than ever before in human history. According to this argument, it is simply counterintuitive that states still insist on trying to manage on a unilateral basis a phenomenon that is so obviously and clearly transnational and global. Now, that's rather a neat conceptual argument. I shouldn't think it holds much water for busy policymakers out there in the world today. I think the second argument perhaps does have rather more traction. This relates migration to globalization, and this focuses our attention on the principal underlying causes of migration. And the point here is that these underlying forces are very powerful indeed, and they are beyond the control of any single state. They, for example, relate to disparities in demography, in democracy, and in development. They relate to what the ILO has described as the global jobs crisis, which of course has been heightened by the recent global economic and financial crisis. It's about segmented labour markets, it's about a burgeoning migration industry, it's about the role of social and migration networks too. No single state is able to control such powerful underlying forces. Look no further than the United States, plainly the most powerful state in the world today, but still host to perhaps 1/3 of the world's irregular migrants. The argument here, I think, is that no state alone can manage these forces, and therefore, even if your only ambition is to achieve national policies, you need to make sure you're cooperating in order to achieve those national policies. So to realise your selfish interests of just realising your national policies, you must make sure that you cooperate in order to begin to address these underlying forces. A third argument that I think we often come across relates to so-called protection gaps. The obvious protection gap, of course, relates to irregular migrants. We don't know, of course, by definition the numbers, but 30, 40, 50 million people who find themselves in an irregular situation as migrants around the world today and basically fall outside any existing legal framework. We know that we have the UN Migrant Workers Convention, which does extend some rights to irregular migrants, but equally we know that that convention has been rather poorly ratified and rather poorly implemented. I think the protection gaps don't just relate to irregular migrants, but also to regular migrants too. And look no further than recent reports by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch about the treatment of some domestic workers, for example, in some Gulf states, and you'll get the point that I'm trying to make. The argument here is that it may be that greater global governance of international migration, that perhaps a single UN agency, that perhaps a more consolidated legal framework might move towards filling some of these protection gaps. A fourth argument relates to future trends, and I was very lucky earlier on to get the end of the presentation on climate change. The big debate here clearly is about people who will be forced to leave their countries as a result of the effects of climate change. And I accept, of course, that the balance of literature is that most people will move short distances, probably internally as IDPs, but still there is some recognition that at least some people will be forced to leave their countries to cross national borders as a result of the effects of climate change. As we know, at the moment, these people fall outside the existing legal framework. They are not defined as refugees, they would not fit the 1951 Convention, and so on and so forth. Another category of people who might be affected by climate change, who equally fall outside current legal frameworks, are people who would be made stateless because their small islands are submerged by the sea, and so on and so forth. So some argument about the need for reform to try to make sure that we can address future challenges that I think are coming perhaps quite quickly in the world of international migration. A final argument that I've come across that again I think is relatively convincing relates to momentum. There is an argument that when talking about global governance of international migration, we are not pushing at a door that is firmly closed and locked. We have increasing indications that there are some initiatives that are moving towards some form of global governance of international migration, and that there are two that spring to mind straight away. One is, of course, the Global Forum on Migration and Development, met for the fourth time, I believe, last year in Mexico City. The Swiss are hosting it this year. It appears to be continuing as a process. It appears to be gaining traction, more states involved in a more realistic and constructive way, and so there seems to be some momentum around the Global Forum on Migration and Development. Another example might be the Global Migration Group that meets normally here in Geneva, that tries to bring together the various institutions that are involved in trying to manage migration. So there is some momentum around the global governance of international migration. Next slide, please. Equally, and I think this slide and these points are often overlooked or underestimated when we speak about the global governance of international migration, there are some very significant obstacles. One clearly relates to sovereignty. It seems to me that international migration strikes in many ways at the very heart of sovereignty. It's about economic competitiveness. It's about border control. It's about social integration. It's about the meaning of the nation and sometimes the state too. And in some circumstances, it can be about national security as well. We shouldn't be surprised that most states guard very jealously their right to control a phenomenon that is so directly linked to national sovereignty. I think that's a reality that we simply need to accept. A second obstacle that I have come across increasingly when I attend international meetings on international migration is what I've sort of by shorthand described here as friction between the North and the South, by which I mean I think there's an increasing friction between overpopulated countries in the South with large, growing populations, rapidly expanding populations, that I think are finding it hard and will find it hard to employ these rapidly expanding populations. There's demand from these countries, I think, for access to the wealthier labour markets of the North. This, I think, is in part met by demand for that labour in some of the labour markets in the North. We all know the arguments that many of our countries from Europe and North America do indeed need migrant labour. The problem is, of course, that the demand for access is far higher than the supply of jobs that we are willing to offer. And increasingly I come across a friction between the South demanding effectively unfettered access to labour markets of the North, and the North demanding control over who comes, when they come, with what qualifications, and when they'll come, and when they'll go home. So international friction, I think, is appearing around this idea of global governance. Thirdly, I think we shouldn't underestimate institutional inertia, and this is something I'm acutely aware of working here in Geneva. The various organisations, most of which are based here in Geneva, that work on various aspects of international migration, have mandates. These mandates were laid down often 50 years ago when migration was a very different phenomenon, but those mandates are largely guarded and secured by the governing states. I don't think there's much stomach to make radical reform to the mandates of many of these institutions. These institutions tend to enter into competition. There's overlap between these competitions. I mean, it's quite striking that even here in Geneva, different organisations use different definitions and concepts, don't share their data on fairly basic issues such as trafficking and so on and so forth. So there is, to an extent, an institutional inertia or lack of willingness, I think, to coordinate. The fourth obstacle is what I've described here as a lack of consensus. And really here I'm pointing the finger at people like myself, who I guess I'm a proponent of greater global governance, and perhaps some of you in the audience are too. I don't think we have made a convincing case for what exactly we want. Do we want a new UN body that focuses on international migration? Do we want the IOM to become part of the United Nations? Or do we simply want states to be more responsible and to recognise human rights as a more important priority? Do we want more effective bilateral agreements? Do we want stronger regional consultative processes? We're not clear, and I don't think we've made a clear statement about quite what we want in terms of our pursuit of global governance. And I think that lack of consensus is important, and of course gives a very strong excuse to policymakers not to really take some of these arguments as seriously as perhaps they should and they might. The final point on this slide, before I come to my final slide, is something I've been reflecting on recently. I just wonder, and perhaps we don't have the evidence yet, and perhaps we don't have enough research yet, but I just wonder whether the global financial crisis, which we hope is now coming to an end, represents a missed opportunity for greater global governance of international migration. We know that in certain sectors, clearly finance being the best example, the global financial crisis spurred greater global governance. Think about the resurgence, for example, of the G20. That didn't appear to be the case for international migration. On the whole, states responded to the challenges of the global financial crisis as they affected migration on a bilateral basis, sometimes through regional processes, but largely on in a national unilateral manner. And I think perhaps an opportunity was missed there, perhaps by some of the international organisations, to take this opportunity to really promote something rather more effective and global. If we could have my final slide, please. Let me just conclude with some personal reflections, and perhaps these are reflections based on the fact that as I age, I'm increasingly cynical, and as I'm based in Geneva, I'm increasingly give up hope for grand reform, and perhaps things look different in Canada and for the younger people amongst you.